How are we doing?
Looks good. All right, I'm sitting start on the webinar. Thanks. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get us started with our session of the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless Education Series. So this session is entitled Colorado's Affordable Housing and Homelessness Crisis, What is the State Doing? And we're going to be speaking with some experts on the matter. And as always, we'll go ahead and start with a bit of data to set the stage. First things first, we're going to do a little housekeeping. We have live captioning available. So in order to be more accessible, we have this turned on. If you'd like to see captions that are auto-generated, just hit the CC at the bottom of the screen, select show subtitle, and you should be able to see the live captions. If you're having any issue with that, please just put something in the chat and one of our staff members can hopefully help you out with that. As I mentioned for today's agenda, we're gonna do a little bit of data on affordable housing and what it looks like, sort of the crisis we're looking at nationally, statewide, city here in Denver, and just kind of set the stage for where we are and also some of the solutions that are on the horizon. Cameras and microphones are off for anyone who's attending. So if you can just use the chat to connect with others, you can also use the Q&A box to go ahead and ask questions that we'll ask at the end. So around 6 is when we anticipate heading into that Q&A period of the event. Just want to warn everyone, the session is being recorded to allow folks who couldn't make it today to see it after the fact. So just want to let everyone know that it will be recorded. And then you can share on social media if you'd like, CCH Ed Series or at Colorado Coalition. So we'll go ahead and start with our, thank you, Mary. Mary is reminding us to read each slide and graphic out loud. And thank you for that accessibility reminder, Mary. And as I hand it over to my colleague, Aubrey Wild, I'll just go ahead and let her present the data. And then Aubrey, if you can keep that in mind as you present.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Alexis. So today, to kick us off, we're going to talk a little bit about Coloradans' perspective on affordable housing, some housing and homelessness connection, and the crises we're experiencing as far as rents and availability of housing, eviction rates, renters versus homeowners, homeownership rates, including by race and ethnicity, and then a few points on what we know work so we can start our conversation in a solution-oriented kind of way. So there was some recent polling done by the Colorado Health Foundation, and what they found was that overall Coloradans are feeling the pressure of this housing crisis. 86% of Coloradans say that the rising cost of housing is an extremely or very serious problem, and 72% of Coloradans consider homelessness an extremely or very serious problem. And these numbers really deserve our attention. And there's a clear connection between housing and homelessness. I think that that's pretty obvious, but the data really bear that connection out. The number of unhoused Coloradans has increased by 266% since 2007. And we know that being homeless can exacerbate pre-existing physical and mental health conditions and lead to a major loss of social connection. And there's just not enough affordable housing available for folks, particularly those with extremely low incomes or no income. And there are not enough resources to connect those people to the housing that does exist. But we also know on the positive side that once people are provided with housing, they tend to remain housed. From a study of some folks that we housed through our social impact bond project, which we can definitely share some more resources on. After 3 years, 77% of people remain housed. And we also know that it's less expensive to just give people housing and the support that they need than it is to just let people languish out on the street unhoused. It costs about half as much to provide housing and supportive services compared to paying for emergency room visits, detox, police response, etc. It's also important to note that minority groups, people of color, make up a larger share of the homeless population than they do of the general population. This is particularly the case with the Black population, Indigenous folks, and people who identify as having two or more races. The proportion of folks in these populations is dramatically higher than the proportion of these folks in the general Colorado population. And I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later, but this is due in no small part to our nation and our state and our city's history of racist and exclusionary housing policies. In total, the point in time count, which is one of our tools to estimate or get a snapshot of homelessness in Colorado, tells us that about 10,000 people are experiencing homelessness statewide, but we know that that number is much higher. At the Coalition for the Homeless, we serve at least 25,000 unique individuals each year. We also know that of recipients of Medicaid, about 53,000 report that they are experiencing homelessness. So the number is somewhere between 10,000 and 54,000. It could even be higher. But the research tells us that housing market conditions, not mental illness, drug use, poverty, weather, generosity of public assistance programs, or low-income mobility explain why some communities have higher rates of homelessness than others. And this image here shows kind of the whole United States, colored based on the number of people experiencing homelessness in each state. And Colorado is kind of in the middle there with a medium blue, but this is total number, not based on population size or area. So like I mentioned, we have a cost crisis and we also have an availability crisis when it comes to housing. With regard to cost, Colorado has the 8th highest housing wage in the country, and the housing wage means the amount that someone has to earn to afford a modest apartment. And so in Colorado, somebody has to earn almost $29 per hour to afford housing in this state without spending too much of their income, making it unaffordable. And so to put this in context, a minimum wage worker earning $12.56 per hour would have to work 92 hours per week to make that pencil out. And this image on the right here is, again, a map of the United States, colored based on housing wage, and Colorado is one of the darkest blue states. There's also a lack of availability when it comes to affordable rental housing. In Colorado, there are 29 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 extremely low income renters. And we define extremely low income as families earning less than 30% of the area median income. And in Denver, a single person living at 30% area median income would look like about $22,000 per year, compared to someone at 80% area median income making about $56,000 per year. And the image on the right is, again, a map of the United States, colored based on availability of homes. And Colorado is in dark red among just a few other states who have fewer than 30 affordable homes for every 100 extremely low income renters. So take that number compared to the availability of homes for families earning 80% of area median income, whereas there are only 29 for the lowest income families. There are 94 available and affordable units across the state for every 100 Colorado families living at that 80% area median income level. So this really gets at where the severe need is, and it's among those folks living at the lowest income levels. So in total, Colorado has a shortage of about 175,000 rental homes that are affordable and available to the extremely low income renters in our community. And one of the reasons why this is because there's been a real decrease in the number of homes that have been built over the last decade, about 40% fewer compared to the decade previous, from 2000 to 2010. So that's been one factor driving this housing crisis that we're in today. Metro Denver home prices over this last decade have increased by about $100 a day, which is pretty dramatic. And median rent in Denver has doubled between 2010 and 2022. So all of these factors have made it really challenging for folks at low income levels to find rental and purchase opportunities. And when people are spending too much on rent, when rents are too high, they are at risk of being cost burdened or severely cost burdened. 74% of extremely low income earners are severely cost burdened, which means they're spending over 50% of their income on rent. And this means that there's very little income left for things like childcare, transportation, food, medicine, medical care. And affordable rents for a full-time worker earning minimum wage is only $653, which I think everybody here knows is about impossible to find in Denver or even across the state. And when people are cost burdened, they're spending too much on rent, leaving less for other priorities, eviction becomes a big risk. Eviction is a legal process that goes through the courts. Landlords can file an eviction based on failing to pay rent or late rent, violating lease clauses, staying past the lease expiration date, or substantial violations that endanger people or the property, like drug trafficking or violence. And landlords often file evictions due to small amounts of unpaid rent. I was the co-author on a report from 2017 called Facing Eviction Alone, and I found that the lowest dollar amount that a landlord filed for was $4. So even though usually the line is that landlords don't want to evict people, it's expensive, it's time consuming, it can actually be kind of lucrative in a hot housing market like we have now, because if you can get someone out and then get someone in to pay a higher rent, then that might benefit you. So it's really important that we have really strong eviction protections for folks who are renters in our area. Right now in the Denver, Aurora, Lakewood metropolitan area, 13.3% or 132,000 tenants are at risk of eviction because they're behind on their rent right now. It's also worth noting that eviction levels are back to pre-pandemic levels. We avoided that big tsunami of evictions that many organizations like ours were predicting because of the great work of Denver and the state of Colorado and the federal government providing financial resources to keep people housed. So that's fantastic, but those numbers are climbing. And there are some important disparities in evictions that are worth noting. Eviction rates are significantly higher for Black renters and Latinx renters. In particular, Black women with children are at the greatest risk of being evicted. And again, that's not because they are bad renters, but because there's a history of exclusionary housing policies in our city, state, and country, and those have ripple effects into today. Next slide, please. And we'll talk a little bit about homeownership today as well, but I want to draw some differences between renters and owners. Renters are less likely to be caught up on housing payments than owners. They're more likely to fall behind. Housing comprises a much greater proportion of total expenditures for renters than for owners. And this is especially true for lower income households. And renters report more involuntary moves, late payments, food insecurity, and hardship in general than owners. And so this indicates that renters are in a more precarious situation in many cases, largely because of their income or wealth level, but also it's just a less stable position to be in. And homeownership is the best way for families to build intergenerational wealth. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Renters aren't able typically to build that equity and build that wealth through renting. And this is a graph that shows the Colorado median income and house value from 2012 all the way to 2020. And you can see the difference in how those lines look. The top yellow line shows median house value, and that has more than doubled over that period of time. Whereas median household income has remained pretty stable over those last 8 years. So that is another factor, that imbalance between housing costs and income, that have created this situation that we're in today. And again, there are some racial disparities when it comes to homeownership in Colorado. The homeownership rate among white people is about double that of Black individuals. And people who identify as Hispanic and mixed race and other, that level is also much lower than white families in Colorado. So what do we know works? We know that we need more funding. At the federal level, that's the biggest thing that our representatives can do, is advocate for more funding. At the federal level, home and CDBG dollars, two of the biggest housing programs, have essentially been cut in half since the start of those programs. And so that has meant less money coming to Colorado and other states to support things like development and rent assistance. It's also worth noting that Colorado has invested significantly in housing and homelessness recently, and that was enabled by some of the recovery dollars from the federal government. We have been able to invest about $650 million in housing and homelessness, about $450 million in housing, and another $200 in homelessness support. This is limited time funding though, so this has to be allocated by 2024 and spent by 2026. And so we'll need to keep our eye on ways to make sure that programs that are supported by these dollars are continued beyond that time period, and that we continue to put resources into these systems. We also know that a housing first approach works. When we give people housing, they're able to tackle other challenges in their life, like vocational and mental health challenges. We also know that supportive services work. When people have case management and behavioral health support and vocational support, cooking classes, money management classes, they do better in housing and they're more able to thrive in their lives. We also know that that saves a lot of money to communities and taxpayers. We also know that vouchers with strong source of income protection, so people can actually use those vouchers, work. And we know that universal design is essential so that these physical spaces that we're building for individuals and families work for everybody. And we also know that it's important to clear pathways and create support along the continuum of housing, from homelessness to homeownership, for the lowest income households in particular. And with that, I will turn it back to Alexis.
Thanks so much, Aubrey. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists for today. The first I will introduce is Aubrey, who we just met, who was doing that presentation. Actually, Andrew, thank you, Andrew. So Aubrey Wild is the Advocacy Program Director at the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, where she specializes in legislative and government affairs activities. She has a breadth of experience in Colorado's nonprofit sector, most recently as a Family Economic Security Program Associate at the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. She has also worked with the State Services Division at the National Conference of State Legislatures, the Rocky Mountain Community Land Trust, and Planned Parenthood of the Rocky Mountains. She graduated from Colorado College with a bachelor's degree in sociology and has a master's in public administration with a concentration in hazards, disasters, and emergency management from the University of Colorado, Denver. In her free time, she loves to mountain bike and spend time with her wife, Nikki, and cat, Bruce. Thanks for joining us, Aubrey. Secondly, we have Jonathan Capelli. Jonathan is an experienced urban planning, real estate, and community development professional focused on finding ways to bring equitable and sustainable development to communities across Colorado. Prior to founding Capelli Consulting, Jonathan worked at the Urban Land Conservancy, helping lead real estate acquisition and redevelopment projects, building community capacity engagement in the Westwood neighborhood of Denver, Colorado, and coordinating various national and regional housing policy initiatives. Jonathan holds an MA in urban planning from the University of Colorado and a BA in political and environmental science from St. Olaf College. He serves on the boards of Housing Colorado, All in Denver, Mile High Connects, and on the Affordable Housing Committee of the Urban Land Institute of Colorado. Welcome, Jonathan. And finally, we have Angie Nelson, who serves as the Deputy Director of Housing Stability and Homelessness Resolution for the Denver Department of Housing Stability. Angie has worked in policy and programs to address homelessness with Denver Human Services, Denver's Road Home, and Host. Prior to working with the city, she developed and led transitional housing programs for Denver Rescue Mission and Warren Village. Angie is a licensed clinical social worker and holds a master's degree in social work and bachelor's degree in pre-professional counseling. She's a demonstrated record of collaborative stakeholder engagement and innovative systems change. So welcome, Angie. All right, so as always, we like to start these with our data presentations, but we know that that doesn't cover everything. So what do you think was maybe missing from that data presentation that really informs your work? Maybe what didn't tell the whole story, or surprise, or maybe something that surprised you as someone who works in the sector? And that's to anyone here.
You guys did such a good job. Obviously, the data was complete. I'm certainly happy to defer to any of the other panelists. You know, I don't know that it's anything that's particularly missing, but certainly I think that the conversation around housing stability and homelessness for us also involves the conversation around prevention, you know, those programs and rental assistance and things that we're doing to try and wrap around families and households before they face a housing crisis to prevent that fall into homelessness. And I know Aubrey mentioned that to an extent that, you know, the work and the investments from the federal government and from the state and our local governments to try and support folks with rental assistance throughout COVID has really demonstrated just how impactful those programs are by the number of folks we prevented from evictions through that time frame. But I think that's one thing that stuck out to me just as another piece of this story for us to tell and talk through tonight.
Yeah, I agree. Very comprehensive. There's something that my colleague Mary Coddington always likes to say, which is that there's not a single housing crisis. It's a whole bunch of housing crises all happening at the same time, and so you know, it's hard to point to any one thing. And I think you did a good job of covering that, or kind of describing that, Aubrey. A couple of other ones that come to mind are you know, so there's the supply and demand issue, but there's also, which you mentioned, there's also the role of institutional investors, you know, coming through neighborhoods. Renee Martinez-Stone over at the West Denver Cornerstone Collaborative has discovered that of recently displaced families in Western Denver that are that are within a certain income range, low income, about 40% of all the purchases of where they used to live are from investors, not like new families moving in. So it's not just richer people coming to these neighborhoods and gentrifying, it's actually investors that are buying 40% of those homes of people who recently left the school system who were low income. So you know, that's a huge impact. And then there's just land use and, you know, NIMBYism. Every time there's an affordable housing development that any of the members of NDC or anything that CCH tries to put together, any of those groups, there's often, almost always, a cacophony of riotous voices that are trying to squash it, despite the fact that verbally, 80% of folks in Denver and Colorado believe that there's a need for affordable housing, just not near them. And so you combine all those issues, and then it creates the situation we have today.
Thank you so much for adding that context in. And once again, Aubrey put together a great presentation along with Andrew West, our housing policy fellow. So thank you to them for covering it all. And this is a good point to let folks know that we'll send that slideshow out when we follow up with an email. So if you missed anything or you want to share with anyone, that'll be coming to you in the next couple of days. So question for Jonathan. We talked about disparities by race, ethnicity, gender, and more. These are the current numbers, but we know that this is tied to historical practices. Someone who maybe doesn't know a whole lot about affordable housing and and about the crisis. What do you think they need to know about some of the historical factors that create these circumstances that are really present today?
There's a lot of history there.
Yeah, we could do a whole other session just on the history and another one just on the history of Denver. So I recognize that's a tough question, and I apologize.
No, that's fair question. Let's see. We'll start with humans have fought over land for all of human existence. It's part of us. Geography is power, access to resources, and it's something that we've always sort of fought over, and it's also something that we've always tried to divide and keep other people, the other, out and away from that. So how does that look in cities? It looks like instead of a wall, it's a red line, right, drawn around certain neighborhoods and areas where investment will not flow, and loans won't be granted, and homeownership will be denied. And that's something that was a formal policy basically from the 30s until the 60s that prevented whole generations of Black and brown people from having access to homeownership. But that's just that's what most people I think of when they think of the historic impediments to homeownership. But it goes back even further with how our country was first constructed, and then reconstructed in the Civil War with nothing in reparations to sort of get Black families off on at least, if not even, but even footing with lower income white families. Then you get to how land was divvied up during the Homestead Act, where you had millions of families that went white, that went west, that in unjustly, right, stolen land had access to that, but then a compounded injustice of it only going to white families, right? So you had free home ownership that just increased white home ownership rate again, in a way that other ethnicities didn't have access to. Then you have federal housing programs, such as the GI Bill and other bills that were trying to sort of inject wealth and create this middle class, right, which is what sort of drove America's strength and and strong economy over the years. It was the backbone thereof, and then a disproportionate distribution of funds in that way too. There's about $120 billion that were invested in housing programs between 1930 and 1960, and only 2% of them went to non-white families. And then finally you get to public housing, where even the first housing programs that were ostensibly good were still highly segregated. My dad is white, and he grew up in New York, and he was in sort of a public housing project that was all white, and then folks on my mom's side of the family were in a completely different situation. So it's just interesting how that all works. But so all that comes together. I wanted to be short, but I think it just was long, so sorry. But the last thing I would note is just that there was the just the Great Recession. Great Recession comes through, and whatever progress was made for Black and brown homeownership was basically eviscerated at disproportionate rates. So today you have Black homeownership, and I think brown homeownership as well are lower now than they were when discrimination was fully legal before the Fair Housing Act of 1968. One could ask, why is Black and brown homeownership trailing white homeownership? But another way of looking at it would be, how is it doing so well given this history of impediments? Is sort of a flipping around of that. I'll stop there. I don't know if anyone, Angie, did I miss anything? Aubrey, I probably missed a lot.
That was the briefest masterclass I've heard on many of those issues. So thank you. One piece I thought of, which is more of a historical practice than a policy, but is around like source of payment discrimination. So we think about when people have a housing voucher, when they finally get that precious resource in their hands, and for a long time, homeowners, landlords, rental companies were able to say, oh, you're paying with the housing subsidy or housing voucher, no thank you, and discriminate against folks. And that was, you know, just another tool of discrimination. We see that, you know, we know that legislation has passed that prohibits that kind of source of payment discrimination locally, but landlords try to get around that. And I think similarly, you know, we see it in really prohibitive HOA fees, you know, to even be able to live in a property. You know, it's not illegal for the HOA to charge high fees, but that's another way to gatekeep and determine how to keep folks out, as well as, you know, the tactic to just raise the rent just above the fair market standard, just out of reach for those who have vouchers. So I think those are, outside of those really powerful and discriminatory practices that you're speaking about, I think that also just worth noting that there are practices that we know happen today as well that are prolonging these impacts.
I would just add quickly that the Coalition for the Homeless is going to be co-leading an effort to close some loopholes on that source of income non-discrimination law at the state level at the during this 2023 legislative session. So to those of you who in the chats have expressed some interest in advocating with us, we'll be calling on you.
Thank you all. So Angie, the Denver Department of Housing Stability is relatively new. What has HOST done to impact affordable housing availability here in Denver, and sort of what lessons have you learned over the past few years?
Yeah, so I really appreciate, Alexis, that you reached out for HOST to be able to be part of this conversation. I think anytime that we're talking about, you know, issues that impact the whole state, it's so great to be able to think about it in terms of our local community response, our state response, and our federal response, and how they're all tied in together. So for those of you who are new to understanding the Department of Housing Stability, as Alexis said, we've only been around for just under 3 years. We celebrate our 3rd anniversary next week. So we're an agency that came together within the city of Denver to try and tie together the work that happens across this whole spectrum of need, from the need to help people maintain the housing they have and prevent episodes of homelessness, the work that we do to try and quickly resolve an episode of homelessness when it happens, and to work towards housing solutions. So opportunities for affordable housing development, affordable home ownership, and policies that help make sure that, you know, ultimately that race isn't the predictor in our community for whether you face housing instability or face homelessness. And so I think in working to set up this program, our big focus has been on making sure that we have alignment across that whole spectrum, that we aren't only focused on homelessness services, that we aren't only focused on housing, but that we're marrying the two, because housing is the solution to homelessness ultimately. So we think that that's been a powerful piece that we've been able to do locally, to just align those resources, align the staff, and work in a coordinated fashion. I think that another big piece that we continue to learn and do is that as we work to address homelessness in a way that's really trauma-informed and person-centered, that we have to balance the need for really right now interim solutions that manage the crisis with the need for longer term solutions that really resolve the issue. So housing, right? Like increasing access to affordable housing. We can build all the different types of shelters. We can build all the different opportunities for temporary housing, but nothing fits everyone like a place of your own. And so I think that that's a lot of what we've been learning and doing. And then just a few numbers to share about how HOST, to your question specifically about what are we doing to impact affordable housing. So right now we have over 24 active sites with around, let's see, 1,100 affordable homes now under construction, with the gap financing and the support from the Department of Housing Stability. And thanks to Denver voters, we're currently funding 1,800 additional affordable homes with supportive services for people exiting homelessness, as well as constructing 2 new shelters that provide a non-congregate shelter environment, so some more private space for households through our general obligation bond, and just working to do more of what we know works, which is connecting folks to housing.
Thank you, Angie. Jonathan, I was hoping you could speak to the way investment in affordable housing can support people along the housing continuum from homelessness to home ownership.
Sure. Do you want to give just a shout out to host, everything Angie's saying? The Denver, back in 2013, I think it had like a $3 million revolving loan fund, right? And so the size of your guys' program, the amount of funding that's come forward since then, sort of in step with the worsening of the crisis, has been impressive. But yeah, so for this continuum conversation, I think that over the last few years, a lot of folks in the housing world have started to realize that we've been talking about housing maybe a little bit incorrectly. I think it was because we had to. There was, affordable housing before it became an issue, where so many folks were experiencing the pressure, was kind of a 4-lettered word. And people, candidates wouldn't talk about it, didn't make it into presidential discussions, let alone ones at city council, without it being extremely conflict brewing. So we kind of stayed away from that and stayed away from what I think we actually are doing here. So it's not so much that we're creating units, that's not the goal. We might say that safe and affordable housing, but the real goal is to create avenues for people to thrive. And housing is one of the ways to do that. Housing is not the end in itself. It's kind of the first step along a path towards thriving, financially, socially, psychologically, and in every possible way, health. And so with that mindset, Bill Windsor was the director of real estate at CCH for many years. And he once said to me that his dream outcome for any of his tenants is when one, gets into a Habitat for Humanity or CLT home, eventually down the line. So how do we do that and increase the movement of folks up the continuum to places where they can continue to thrive more? One of the ways you need to do that is, and it's kind of in CCH's name, or the type of housing that you guys put together, permanent supportive housing. So how do we have more supports and more funding for supports? Talking about economic resiliency classes or financial health classes, just general education, everything you can think of to help folks make sure they stay housed once they're housed, and then thrive from there. And unfortunately, in the housing finance and funding world, that isn't something that's easily funded historically. Folks, imagine you're a legislator, you have a few $1 million, and you want to say that I'm going to have, there's going to be 1,000 new homes that are created out of this. Well, we need some of those funds to ensure really good outcomes for the people that we house. So I have to say only 800 people will be housed. I don't know, I'm not going to pretend to get in the minds of, but it's, how do we make sure that we aren't just counting units as the only measure of success, and there are other metrics that we're counting? Stop there.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we saw at the very beginning of the presentation that affordable housing is an issue for most Coloradans. Everyone is really recognizing that this is an issue, whether personally to them or to people they know, including those at the lowest economic level, but also for middle class folks who are at maybe 50 to 80% of the area median income. Let's say for Aubrey, from a policy perspective, why is it important to address the needs of those living at 30% AMI or lower, rather than everyone who is struggling, all equally, to bring all the resources to everyone struggling through the affordable housing shortage?
That's a good question, Alexis, and a really politically charged one too. That was what a lot of our debates over this last legislative session revolved around. But I think the data shows pretty clearly that the greatest need is at that 30% area median income level and below. Certainly there is some need at the 50%, 60%, 80% area median income levels. Typically at the Coalition for the Homeless, we serve those at 60% and below. And then a lot of the programs that help support folks are also at that level. Some of the bills that were passed last year target folks at a little bit higher AMI levels, but I think it's just essential that we support the people who we know are struggling the most, who are living on the margins the most. Well, I've been hearing this term a bit lately, trickle down housing. The idea that let's just keep building. It doesn't matter what we build, as long as we build, then more people will get housed. And then eventually those benefits will trickle down to the people struggling the most to get housed or stay housed. And building is a huge component of the solution, but it is not the entire it's not the entire solution. And when we do build, it's essential that it's really targeted. That's how we ended up with 20,000 empty luxury apartment buildings in Denver. And at least that many people who are experiencing homelessness. People tend to rent down. Just because something is built doesn't necessarily mean it will be rented or purchased. And without any guardrails, developers are always going to try to get the biggest bang for their buck. And that often means building in that luxury area.
Thanks, Aubrey. Does anyone else have other thoughts on that and sort of the trickle down housing theory?
Go ahead.
Nope, you go ahead.
It's just a phrase I haven't heard it used in that way, but it perfectly kind of parallels the fallacy of trickle down economics as well, right? So I just was making my note over here about that to look into it more just as a way of categorizing the issue or thinking about it. But I think, this is exactly why we work. So we know that, yes, there are needs across the range of incomes, and that even folks in those 50 or 60% AMI, 80% AMI are still going to be challenged to make ends meet and thrive, as Jonathan was saying, without access to affordable housing. But I think in the presentation, there was a really impactful slide that showed, there's for every 100 people at 50 to 80% AMI, there's 84 housing opportunities available to meet that income range. But when you talk about those much lower income ranges, the current resources available to meet those needs are much less, so that so many fewer people actually have access. And so, we take that approach locally to try and have a range of interventions, a range of policies and products that can meet people where they're at, because we know everyone deserves to be healthy, housed, and connected, but a lot of focus on very low income, 0 to 30% area median income for our investments into housing.
Awesome. Thank you. So we've been talking sort of more about the problems, and I want to move to talking more about solutions. That's sort of, the goal of our webinars is always to kind of let people know about the issues being faced, but then also to have conversations about what's being done. So sort of starting with a federal level, we know that the majority of federal spending is reactive. I think Jonathan was alluding to this earlier. It sort of goes to short-term and reactive solutions to homelessness, such as funding for shelters and other emergency responses. It's not typically going to prevention of homelessness, helping people stay when they're already housed. Are there any sort of federal policies that you all know of or recommend or think that the federal government should consider to kind of proactively and substantially impact affordable housing throughout the U.S.?
I'll take a stab and happy to let others chime in. I'm sorry, I'm trying to like read the Q&A and read the chat, and there's so many places, there's so many questions. So hopefully we'll get to all of them. In addition to these great and thoughtful questions you have as well, Alexis. But I mean, yes, I think I loved the slide where you said, you know, we know what works and we need to do more of it. I think that that's absolutely the key, right? The most effective strategy to get people back into housing is to quickly get people back into housing, that housing first approach, and then work to meet their other needs. Which may be healthcare, treatment, things like that. And that housing and services together are really essential, especially as people you know, have other life challenges, are aging, things like that. But so I think things like subsidizing rentals to the extent that, you know, fully funding the housing choice voucher program, fully funding tenant-based rental assistance. Our federal government has long subsidized housing. They've just chosen to do it for the most affluent group of people, for homeowners. If we were to fund housing choice vouchers to that same level, you know, we would have the opportunity for everyone who income qualifies to be able to have housing that's affordable to them. So that's the one thing that, like, if I had a magic wand, I would wave it and we would have adequate subsidy for everyone at all incomes to be able to afford housing that's out there. So that's my contribution to the question.
Agreed, stole one of mine. So yes, definitely agree. One quick note, just back to that earlier question, or the question about middle income housing and supply. It's just, you know, there is obviously there are housing needs across the entire spectrum. Some of it is supply and demand driven, and on the lower income side, it's driven by things more complex than that aren't just attributable to supply and demand. You know, all this talk, funds for middle income housing, and all these things started in like 2020, right? Basically, 2020, 2021. The proof that when we had these supply issues, the proof that the lowest income housing is something beyond that, like the needs go beyond that, or are not just attributable to supply and demand, is the fact that John Pravinsky founded CCH in, was it 95? Something like
84.
That? Okay, 84. Okay, so this is not a new issue. This isn't like, oh, if you just stop, you know, if you just create more housing at this income level, then it's going to solve homelessness. That's never been the case in Colorado, and isn't now either. Not to say that there aren't housing needs across the spectrum. They exist, but just sort of get it straight for why there are these issues, and what tool we need to apply to which problem. For your question about waving the wand, yeah, I really like what you said, Angie, about vouchers. You know, we treat, we've sort of decided as a society that people starving to death is going to be extremely rare in this country, and so we have vouchers, you know, or SNAP, right? And programs like that where it's based on the need. There's a lottery where if you don't get it, you just starve to death, right? We've decided with homelessness that that's not going to be the case. It's not as important. And so we will just let people live on the street and don't match it to the needs. So I think we need to start treating housing, especially acute housing needs, with the same seriousness that we treat some of these other human services and health issues, and then we'd actually not have quite the acute issue that we have today. Also, I just think that while middle income and higher income homeownership is highly subsidized through taxes and other things, affordable housing, affordable homeownership is less well funded. At the state level, it's something like only 10% of funds last year went to homeownership, and about 11% of units for folks making below the median income. And there's no tax credit programs, unlike there are for rental housing. I think we need to create more innovative tools at the same degree of like complexity and importance that we put on rental housing for low income homeownership, not high income, obviously. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I would just add that to build on what you said, Jonathan, about how new some of these conversations are and some of these strategies are. 2019 was the first year Colorado even had any sort of tool to fund home ownership other than just fighting for scraps every year in the long bill or the budget. So it's really recent that we've been investing in this way. So that's something to note. Yeah, so there's a lot of work to be done, but we're just at the beginning.
You
are muted, Alexis.
Thank you, Jonathan. You are a Zoom pro, and I appreciate it. So here in Colorado, legislation passed in the 2022 session that can greatly improve affordable housing opportunities in the state, such as those we saw. I think they were in the slideshow, but maybe not, now that I think about it. But some of those include HB 22-1377, HB 22-1083. Anybody who was working on the legislative session, when do you think we'll start to see the benefits of that legislation, and what do you think that'll look like for folks who are waiting for assistance to come?
I can start on that. And then I know, Jonathan, you are really deep into these conversations too, so feel free to add. But this is that $650 million that I was talking about during that slide presentation. So $450 million were allocated for affordable housing through the Affordable Housing Transformational Task Force bills, and then an additional $200 million for homelessness resolution through the Task Force on Economic Recovery and Relief Cash Fund. And guidance from the Department of Local Affairs is just now coming out as far as how these dollars can be accessed by local communities. And again, we've got to act quickly. These dollars need to be allocated by 2024 and spent by 2026. On the homelessness side, what this might look like is grants to organizations who are already providing these really great services that we know work, organizations and local governments. So that's about $105 million for just projects that orgs and governments are working on. And then two other bills are establishing a couple of campus-based locations for service delivery that can happen all at one location. I don't know if folks on the call today are familiar with our Fort Lyon campus in Los Animas, Colorado, but these two new campus locations will mirror that. It'll be an opportunity for people to access housing, behavioral health care, vocational services, and get those warm handoffs so they don't get lost in this really complicated network of services and applications and attempts to get housing. And then on the affordable housing front, a couple of the bills that we were paying most attention to were the Affordable Housing Grants Program, which again will provide grants to organizations and local governments to help develop housing and provide rent assistance and supportive services, acquire land, and then one bill that created a revolving loan fund to provide flexible, low interest, below market rate loans to do many of those same things. So we should start seeing those dollars flow soon, and hopefully we'll see the impact also soon, but at least with development, we know that that pipeline of development, if you're building from the ground up, can be between 2 and 3 years. So we may not see huge impacts and for a couple of years, but I think this money will allow us to act creatively and quickly to meet immediate needs and think more long-term as well.
Don't have much to add. I think that was pretty comprehensive. Though I guess you listed the bills that we're most excited about that passed. There are a number of other bills that passed that are maybe less on the production side or less on addressing homelessness, but they passed too. So some of what we were talking about the focus on middle income housing, there was a number of bills like that passed. So there was a middle income housing access program expansion, a program with the Colorado Housing Finance Authority, $25 million to that to help folks at I think up to 120% of the median income. There was also a new statewide housing authority that was erected called the Middle Income Housing Authority, the MIHA. And it has the ability to raise funds to create mixed income housing, a lot of which, about approximately half of which, less than half, can be market rate, and then the majority has to be affordable. I think that's also to 120% of the median income. So again, middle income mixed housing. So there's that, and then also those two funds that Aubrey mentioned earlier, the revolving loan fund and the grant fund. Those have fairly high AMIs, but they also go low too. So there's a couple of larger funds that are flexible enough to address middle income needs and low income needs. And then there were some specific bills that were just for middle income housing that passed. So it was a really very interesting session, and a ton of bills that came forward. Of course, almost all of them, except for the revolving loan fund, like Aubrey said, are, they're temporary funds. Folks sometimes ask, wow, all these funds came down, so do we need more housing or more housing funding? And it's like running to a fire, like a house that's on fire, and throwing a bucket on it. What we need is a hose. So a sustainable, renewable, ongoing stream of resources to address housing over the long term. It was an exciting session, but more needs to be done.
Great. And I'll just have one more question here, and then we'll move to Q&A. So voters in Colorado are receiving their ballots this week, with the final date to vote of November 8th. Just reminder to everyone. Election day is November 8th. What are the ballot measures that help to address affordable housing and homelessness in Colorado that y'all are interested in? And please know, Angie, you are not being asked this question, as of course, as a employee of the city of Denver, you do not have opinions on these things that you would be sharing. So Jonathan or Aubrey?
I can jump in on that. So the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless took a position on 3 ballot measures this year, 2 at the state level and 1 at the Denver level. At the state level, we are one of the major supporters behind Proposition 123. And this measure would create the State Affordable Housing Fund and dedicate a portion of state income tax revenue to affordable housing programs and projects, as well as homelessness. And we're supportive of this measure because it provides substantial funding to promote and expand affordable housing. It could generate $300 million annually to build about 170,000 affordable homes without raising taxes at all. It would be the first state-funded investment in homelessness programs and solutions, with about $54 million being made available annually specifically for homelessness resolution. And I really think that this would transform Colorado's housing landscape. Again, it wouldn't be immediate, but it would hopefully be that hose that we need, or at least part of that solution. And then the other state measure that we are taking a position on, we are not supporting. We are advocating for a no vote on Proposition 121. This initiative would decrease the state income tax rate from 4.55% to 4.4%. And we're in opposition to this because it would dramatically reduce the state general fund revenue that's essential for all of these government operations, organizational operations that we've been talking about tonight that are so important. So this could really impact how much money is available for housing and homelessness. This is expected to reduce the state budget by 2.4%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's about $412 million, which is just about equal to how much we pumped into housing in this last legislative session. So that would be really devastating. Also, the benefits of this would largely be for wealthy taxpayers, including corporations. And then on the Denver level, we're supportive of 2K. And this measure is a little wonky, but it's basically just a reaffirmation of something that passed in 2020. Initially, this voter approved measure increased sales tax by 0.25% and used that for homeless resolution. But the city collected more money than we expected we would. We expected about $40 million and we raised about $41 million. So we have to ask voters if we can keep that extra bit of money and then moving forward, collect on that, collect the full amount that was approved in 2020. So this will help host and other entities in Denver deliver on their goals that they've already established. And so it's a really important pot of money, and hope that folks will definitely vote yes on that one as well.
Yeah, I think you covered all of them. Good job.
All right, great.
Well, all of your positions.
I'll go ahead and move to the Q&A section, and we have quite a few in here. So, we may not be able to get to all of them, but we'll go ahead and ask a few. So Stephanie Amaryllis wanted to know if there's a list of affordable housing providers and programs for our region for folks who are case managers, care managers, navigators. Does anyone have general resources? Maybe there isn't one exact place to go, but do folks have resources they could recommend for Stephanie and those she works with?
So I'll start by saying, this is where I started in the field as a social worker, working in transitional housing programs and providing case management for folks experiencing a housing crisis. So I know how critical the access to current information is. So I did put into the chat for folks a link to the Department of Housing Stability's, it's called our resident resources page, and it has links to all kinds of resources all in one place to find a rental unit or a home, a place to apply for eviction and foreclosure assistance, a link to find shelter, a link to get rent and utility assistance, information about affordable home ownership, which we've just recently expanded with an eye towards equity for folks who have historically been in redlined communities, as well as information about employment. So kind of a comprehensive set of resources, and then through there you can click around and find other things. I saw earlier in the chat there were some questions of, well, how do we access host programs? And so I just wanted to provide some quick clarity that most of what we do is in partnership with our nonprofit partners. So places like the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, who receive funding from the city of Denver and then implement the programs. And so the website will have information about where to go and how to get connected with some of our different partner programs, whether it's for shelter or rental assistance. Things like permanent supportive housing for folks experiencing homelessness, all of that goes through a system called One Home, which is our community's coordinated entry to housing system. And so working with a case manager is typically the best way to get connected through One Home in order to be assessed for your particular housing needs in your situation. And if you have needs that rise to the community's priorities around helping those who are currently experiencing homelessness, helping those who have a lot of barriers around their physical health or their ability to work right now, to be able to prioritize folks with the highest needs for those highest intervention services. So working with a case manager and doing the One Home assessment is really the pathway to those supportive housing units that HOST is helping to build.
Thanks, Angie. So one of the questions we have from Randall Loeb is the people who are aging require more supports and diverse housing options, just as youth who do not fit into the description of housing units. Folks need companionship and opportunities for places like the concept of a safe haven. This is a transitional housing structure. Are there ways to make these housing options adaptable to the needs of diverse populations that require unique ways to be safe and stable and live their lives with dignity?
So first of all, hi, Randall. I wish that I could see faces on here. It'd be great to see you. It's been a very long time since we've been in person together. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing this up. And I think that's where at Department of Housing Stability, we're working to support innovative programs that try to meet these needs. We have a partnership with a program called Sunshine Home Share, which is a home sharing program that matches seniors who are looking to age in place in their homes with home seekers who need a safe, affordable place to live. And so that's a program that we partner with. And then on our housing side, we're looking at innovations in housing. So the creation of Urban Peak's new shelter, it's really based on a kind of co-housing type model. We've classified it as non-congregate shelter, but it's an innovation of sort of that co-living, having roommates working and living in a semi-private environment. And we're also doing some advocacy with the Housing Authority around the ability to have roommates while on housing choice vouchers. And we've seen that work successfully. We were in Houston recently doing some shared learning from their city council and their housing authority. And so we know it's happening with federal resources in other jurisdictions. And we're interested to see and really work with our local housing authority for how we can take some of those innovations here as well.
Angie. Jonathan, is there anything we missed with sort of like big picture that you would want to cover now? Because I feel like we're asking lots of questions about specific, and I want to make sure that if there's anything we missed for you, that you have the opportunity to provide that big picture context.
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of things really well. Yeah, I was just thinking through all the different bills that are out there. Yeah, we're also not taking a position on that bill about what was it? Eviction defense funding, right, through the per unit fee. It's just our focus and the focus of many of our partners is to prevent evictions or make them way less likely in the first place, rather than doing something like this, which, you know, Aubrey did say this, but like in a sense, you're charging coalition for the homeless like a per unit fee that will then be used to pay the cost of defending someone who was evicted from a market rate home from like an asshole developer, right? So it's kind of a flawed approach. We wanted to stop evictions in the first place, and that's how we're looking. And so, no position. If it passes, we're going to try to amend it so that it's a little more fair in terms of how it addresses or how it treats organizations that are part of the solution, right? Versus the prime offenders. But it's a complex bill, and it's. I just wanted to mention it because if I didn't know more about this, I would have probably assumed I would have voted for it. It sounds like a good bill, but you read the fine print, and it's like a little off. But that was the exact opposite of the type of question you asked, Alexis. That was a very specific one.
That's okay. I mean, that's why we like having these as panels rather than just presentations, because people, you never know where the conversation is going to go. So I appreciate you jumping in with that. One of the things we noticed in the chat is that folks are interested with resources outside of Denver. So Angie, I know that you definitely are the expert in Denver resources, but as someone who used to work in the field more, and Host, of course, has partners elsewhere. Does anyone have recommendations for resources for folks who are joining us who aren't in the Denver area, but need housing opportunities available to them?
So I'll start with an obvious one, and I'm trying desperately to find some stuff in the background here, some old files, but Metro Denver Homeless Initiative is what's called our region's continuum of care agency. So that's a fancy way to say this is who HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, has designated to pass their funding through to make sure that this whole continuum of care or region has funding to support housing and homeless services. So mdhi.org is their website. And they are a funding entity, but they're also a convener and a collaborator and a space for people to come together and talk about how do we approach these really serious issues in a way that creates more equity and more solutions. And so they have investments from the federal government that get passed through to them, and then they have an annual application for funding so that they can provide resources out to the community. I know CCH is one of the recipients of those funds and provides housing for folks out in Adams County, as well as throughout the metro region with that funding. I guess the other thing I'd say is that really, I don't know a municipality that's not taking a closer look at this right now, who haven't designated resources and staff, or have city council members and mayors who are stepping up to say, hey, we want to do more. And so I think, you know, calling your departments of human service, your departments of community planning and development, and understanding, you know, what are we doing to invest our local funds to support housing, I think is a key thing. And then I know there's also like a Colorado Housing Search.org, I think, is a website where you can go in, and it's not specific to Denver, but you can say, you know, I'm looking for a 2-bedroom apartment in Adams County that accepts housing choice vouchers, or a 1-bedroom where you can have a pet and smoke. And it will give you a listing of all of the housing that either receives subsidies from the government or has subsidized units or accepts vouchers in that area. So that's also a great web tool that can be used for housing search and resident resources.
Thank you. Yeah, Metro Denver Housing Initiative was the name. I think I saw it pop up in the chat with the question. So we touched on this. Oh, sorry, Jonathan, go ahead. I saw you unmute.
No, I think it was all covered. If you're having trouble remembering any of those resources, you can call 211. Mile High United Way will connect you to most of these resources depending on how you answer their questions. So I think that's just a good one. And then a number of the folks that are on the host website, if you get connected to any of the housing counseling organizations or any of them, a lot of them work outside Denver too. Brothers Redevelopment, CHAC, so Colorado Housing Assistance Corporation. So anyway, you can call 211, and also don't think that just because you see the resource on the Denver website, it's only for Denver when it comes to some of the organizations. Actually, just call 211. I think that's easier.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Jonathan. And you know, we update our listing on 211 regularly, and they're really proactive about making sure that the agencies who provide information to them are keeping their accounts active and information up to date. So 211 is great, and being accessible by phone and website and maybe text now. I could be wrong about that, but it's pretty accessible at this point. And for Chantel asking about getting a caseworker, yeah, I'll connect with you after and send you some of the resources about how to get connected here at the coalition. And, you know, we do housing, we do healthcare, and we can get you connected. And it's just different points of entry depending on whether you have family or single or all those factors. But I'll connect. So we're hitting the end of our time now. We're just going to go ahead and wrap up. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Please feel free to email us if you have additional questions, watch past sessions and learn about that. As we go to close out, Andrew, oh, I love Andrew. Thank you, Andrew, for sharing. As we mentioned, ways to impact change. We have our ballot guide out. Once again, we only concentrate on a couple of issues that we think really definitively impact the work that we do in housing and homelessness, but other organizations that are working to increase affordable housing are around, and you can check out other ballot guides. There's so many amazing nonprofits putting out ballot guides. So go to the folks you know and love and see what's on the ballot that you can vote for. I know that ballots are in the mail. You can also join the CCH Advocacy Network, and Aubrey runs that, and it's amazing. We really do impact a lot of legislation by just connecting people who care, people who show up to these things and are invested and want to talk to their legislators, and we can help to connect you to your legislator and make sure that you're writing them a letter, and they have a way to hear you. So those are the ways we suggest. You can also always email us if you want to have an impact. Just let folks know that we'll have our last session of 2022 next month. We're going to be doing that on winter homelessness. And the idea is just to provide resources and knowledge on how folks can help our neighbors as we hit winter. And we know that's a really dangerous time for people experiencing homelessness. So please join us for the next session. And I think that's it. Thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate having you here. And see you next month, November 17th, for the final session of 2022. And we look forward to connecting. Thank you.